exploring the culture, the adventure, and the impact of martial arts. That's what we do at Kung Fu Podcast. And I'm your host, Sifu T.W. Smith. Thank you so much for joining me today. This very wet day here in North Carolina. It's been raining quite a bit. And this particular program may be a little bit delayed going out just because it has been taking, 3 to 4 times more creative driving than it ever does to get around town here lately. Flooding in different areas has really required some reroutes, and nothing quite like that during rush time to help you figure out, patience. Woosah, this is a puzzle problem. Or is this an obstacle problem? I have to think about that. If this is your first time here to Kung Fu Podcast, welcome. You're in the audience of some of the finest and sharpest martial artists in the world. And I can also say without a shadow of a doubt, some of the most intelligent folks you're ever going to run into as well. And one of those committed and intelligent martial artists is the focus of this particular episode. Professor Samantha May and her research on the native language of the Okinawan karate and kabuto, and how did the natural language of the Okinawan people begin to disappear out of their martial arts and as well as out of their lives. There were 4 punishments that were used to persuade Okinawans to stop using their language, and why they would have been shot on the spot for using it. You're going to hear Professor May explain why there must be 2 things that exist in order for the language to stay alive. And as the language was diminishing, you're going to hear about how it begins to separate the generations, not just in martial arts and in the dojos, but across the culture and in families. Professor May is also going to explain why the Okinawans at the time were ready to toss out their native language, even out of the martial arts. And where is that language now? At the end of the interview, I'm going to have a couple of questions that are more or less curiosity questions. I'm also going to give you a list of the incredible number of free downloads that are going to come along with this podcast thanks to Dr. Samantha May. I hope you're ready. Get yourself settled in, or let's go for a walk. But here is the interview with Professor Samantha May and the language of the Okinawan karate and kabuto. During the process, I have not done a whole lot of research as far as, some of your background besides what I ran into as far as on your Facebook page.
Right.
So I'm going to ask you some, because I kind of wanted to experience getting to know you and your work at the same time as the audience does.
Sure.
Okay. Because I always catch a little smack around for pronunciation. So I just want to ask you, I looked up, I found 17 different pronunciations for Uchinaguchi.
Yeah, I believe Uchinaguchi.
Uchinaguchi.
Yeah, it's a long A in the middle, that's all.
Uchinaguchi. Okay, I'll be practicing that. Let's get ready to get started. We'll just kind of roll right into it. Would you like me to address you as Samantha, Professor May? How would you like for me to?
That's totally fine. If you just keep, addressing me as Samantha, that's good. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, because honestly, I'm new to the professor gig, so I think there will still be moments where the students will say professor in the classroom, and I will not remember that that's me. So I should look at them. Yeah. So just Samantha is fine. Yeah.
Okay. We're getting ready to have our interview with Professor Samantha May, whose article I ran across while I was doing research on identity with Dr. Kevin Tan and a few other folks that we've had previous podcasts on. The article I ran across was titled Language, Learning, and the Revitalization Through the Martial Arts, Uchinaguchi, Karate, and Kabuto in Okinawa and Abroad. And was that was your dissertation?
Yeah, that's right.
Well, fantastic.
Yes, that's right.
I wanted to kind of give you a preface of why I got in touch with you to begin with. And I had several podcasts where we had done Dr. Adam Franks had done some research in the late 1990s, early 2000s. His dissertation was Tai Chi Chuan and the Search for the Little Old Chinese Man. And in it, he was finding the identity that through the martial arts, how one finds themselves through the martial arts. And particularly in his case, as an ethnographic study, his research was a lot more about how other people identify themselves through the martial arts, and then how he began to identify himself through the martial arts. And we had Dr. Kevin Tan on about a year ago, where he had done an ethnographic study in Canada on finding your identity through Aikido. So
interesting.
So when I had both of those podcasts were probably like 6 podcasts altogether. But after I finished that, I had ran across a thesis by a young lady named Melissa Tomlinson. And her title of it was The Influence of Identity of Language Use by Bicultural Youth in Okinawa. And her thesis in there really, stimulated my thoughts. And then I did a little bit more research, and then here I am talking with you.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Melissa Tomlinson. Yeah, she was my classmate at the University of VQ. So, yeah. So that's kind of cool that you've seen her research. Yeah. Okay. Well, that puts it in perspective. Did you? How did you find the theses anyway?
I can't remember if I found it through. I'm a member of several academic sites that I will go through and dig around. I also dig through about 5 other research bases and databases for different researchers' studies. Then, of course, I always just basically follow the cookie crumbs, where I run across one research study and just follow the references till I find this golden opportunity to talk to someone like yourself.
Right. Yeah.
Well, Samantha, let me first ask you and tell you a little bit about Kung Fu Podcast. It always starts that we're exploring the culture, the adventure, and the impact of martial arts. And I take that pretty seriously because martial arts had done all that for me when I was learning it, and helped me kind of find my way when I was a big mess up. But when I started looking at this research, it was more about the impact of martial arts. And your work, again, being associated with the Okinawan studies, I wanted to ask you, you had mentioned that you do practice martial arts, correct? Or you did practice martial arts?
Yes. I do still, yes.
Okay, so the audience, of this program are some fine martial artists literally around the world. So I'm excited that they get to hear someone like yourself who's a practicing martial artist and someone who's researched it and then actually using it as a way to carry something else forward. What got you started in the martial arts to begin with?
Basically, when I was 14, we had a fire hall, like for the first time in my tiny hometown of 1,000 people of East Souk on Vancouver Island. We finally had a fire hall built in when I was 12, because people's houses kept burning down because the fire department couldn't get to them. So in that place was a community center, and they had a karate program. And it was, there was really nothing out that way. And my dad said, hey, let's do karate. It's $15 a month, and it's just down, at the fire hall. So I started doing it from there. So I started when I was 14, and it was Okinawan martial arts, Goju Ryu, down at the fire hall. So from there, I got interested in martial arts, and I did it from 14 to 16, and then I quit for about 8 years, and then I got back to it when I was around 24, and then I just kind of kept at it since then.
Just curiosity, when you started the martial arts the second time, what was the driving force behind it that time? Dad got you started the first time.
Yeah, that's right. I think I always wanted to do it again. I just really enjoyed doing it. And when I was 14 or 16, the idea of hitting something was, even like a pad, was pretty terrible. But for some reason, I'd kind of gotten used to that by the time I was 24, and I was totally fine with that contact aspect of the martial arts. And I really liked the kata, especially. And then I started another style, Shorin Ryu, when I was, I think, 26, and or maybe 25. Anyway, and that had a lot of self-defense and bunkai in it. Mm-hmm. So that was another aspect, and that was like a whole different side of the picture, and it was really great to do that as well.
You know, one of the things I've always known, and it doesn't matter what style of martial arts you practice, at some point in time you find some parts of it very challenging, some aspect of it. You know, like you just mentioned, like hitting something. For some other people, the patience, you know, the commitment. You know, what did you find most difficult about the martial arts?
Oh, I think just making the habit of going to the practice. Like, you know, not just once a week or, you know, as many times as you can, like making the time commitment and just going there. But I found once I started that, once I got into the habit, it was an easy habit to keep. But then, you know, other things, influences in your life, like your boyfriend, your kids, your job, whatever it is, those things can really disrupt your, you know, your nice habits that you built up. Yeah,
your routines.
So that's definitely something. Yeah, your routines, and so it's definitely something I'm still working on here, because I practice here, but not that much. So I would really like to practice a lot more than I do now. But again, with the, you know, and the family commitments and even the research, all of that together leaves not that much time in the rest of the day.
I totally understand. So as you went through the martial arts, and then of course, if I remember correctly, what university did you attend for your doctorate work?
So as an undergrad, I went to Douglas College, then Simon Fraser University, and then I went to Okinawa, and I had an opportunity through the Japanese government to go to a Japanese university and do some research, which could turn into a master's and then a doctorate on something to do with Japan. So I thought, okay, if my research doesn't involve karate, I am never going to see the inside of a dojo. So it's going to involve karate. And, you know, and so my master's was about identity, basically answering the question why so many Canadians in particular go to Okinawa for martial arts training. Like, because we're really, I'm Canadian, we're really disproportionately represented in martial arts travel. So, yeah, trying to figure out why that was specifically. I don't know if I did a great job of answering that question, but I found some answers anyway.
What was it like to leave Canada and go to Japan? And I'm assuming you went to Japan and then Okinawa, or did you just go straight to Okinawa and go through the processes of being approved and all that other stuff as you go along?
Well, I went to Japan. I lived there twice. So the first time was after I graduated from Simon Fraser, and it wasn't, you know, to do graduate studies. It was just to go on the JET program, which is Japan Exchange and Teaching Program for teaching English, you know, in Japan at elementary, middle schools and high schools. And I lived in Osaka City, and I hunted out the dojo, like that was closest to my style there. And from there, I went down to Okinawa a few times for martial arts trips. And I lived there for 3 years. Then I moved back to Canada for 5 years. And then that opportunity came up, the scholarship came up from the Japanese government. And it worked out really well because they specifically wanted people who had participated in the JET program. So it was perfect.
So you had a small, that's excellent. And so I just have to ask you, so you get out there, you're putting in your request and trying to get into position to get this scholarship. Did you have to show them your karate at all in order to like? Did you have to do something in order to prove that it would be worth their while to invest that kind of time and effort in you?
You mean as far as the Japanese, as far as the scholarship went?
Yeah, I mean when you get out there.
Yeah, it's actually so going down there the first time, there was actually my sensei, Sensei Frank Clayton, he was operating out of New West and Maple Ridge, which are near Vancouver, and he was going down there with a bunch of students. So I went down there and I met him. So that was kind of my into the dojo the first time. And anyway, but as far as the scholarship goes, so I'd written this proposal and it was sitting on somebody's desk in the consulate, the Japanese consulate in Vancouver, and that the Shorin dojo was on the weekends. And I wasn't going to go because it was just kind of a busy week. But then my husband comes home and says, you have to go to the dojo this weekend because the Deputy Consulate General of Japan is coming to see you there.
Oh, wow.
Okay. All right, then. So I guess I better go. So yeah. So I went, and he was there, and his friend was with him also. And, we didn't know who his friend was exactly, but, another Japanese fellow. So, and then we found out that his friend was Akira Sato, so the founder of Karate Federation BC. So basically, almost all of the dojos in my province have to belong to that organization to get insurance. So, yeah, so they came and they watched the practice and they gave some speeches about, how they really appreciated what they saw at the dojo. And then the Mr. Muto, who's the Deputy Consulate Fellow, invited, it was an open invitation to everybody because we shared the space. It was at that time in North Vancouver with an Aikido dojo. And he said, it would be great if you guys can come to my office in the consulate anytime and we can just have a chat. And, presumably about martial arts and things like that because all martial artists like to talk about martial arts, I think. So, yeah. But I don't think anybody else took him up on that, but I did. And I went and I saw him in his office a few times. And,
wow!
It was a lot of fun. It was great. Yeah, he was a really interesting fellow, really committed to doing development projects in developing countries because he was basically a diplomat and sent to various postings for 2 to 3 years at a time by the government. So that was a whole can of worms.
So when you leave Canada, you go to live in Okinawa.
Yeah.
Was there anything that really stuck out in your memory as far as a cultural challenge?
Oh, okay. So at that point, right? So after I met with this consulate general fellow and I did get the scholarship, I went there. I'd been to Japan before, as I said, living in Osaka City, and Okinawa is different, but it's enough like other parts of Japan. And I didn't really find like it was a cultural challenge. I found it maybe easier, I think, because it seemed like the Okinawans were more accepting of like non-Okinawan cultures and people than they are on the mainland. So I'd say that part was kind of easier. Adjusting to, the school culture, that was different. So we had different expectations for school, but it was more like paperwork challenges than anything really difficult. Yeah, and then my family background is partly Asian as well, so there's a lot of overlap, I would say, between different Asian cultures. So yeah, so that was okay too.
Okay, and I can tell you obviously were not facing a barrier by language. You speak Japanese? Yeah, it's not that great, honestly. It's and I'm not being modest at all. Like it's really not that great. It's about intermediate level. Okay. So there are people who can speak it much better than I can, for sure. And it's something that I would really like to improve. But in a way, having that sort of kind of mediocre level has served me pretty well, because
people during the interviews, which I had to conduct in Japanese a lot of the time, it's pretty clear when you don't understand something. So people end up explaining something much more than they would if you appeared to get it completely right away. So
I don't know how much different it is in Japanese or Uchinaguchi, but in the Chinese, a lot of times it used to amaze me that I would read something or look at something in Chinese writing, and it would be, let's say, 12 characters, right? Yeah. And then to translate it into English was like 4 paragraphs.
Okay, right. Yeah,
because
I would imagine.
A lot of times it was, they would say things like, you'll move your body as if you're reeling silk. But that didn't, so when they would say something like that, you had to understand what reeling, moving, and thinking like reeling silk was. But since the English, it meant nothing to someone like me when I first began. So, trying to actually say, okay, this is the mechanics of what that means. This is the sensations. Mm-hmm. And when you actually feel it and you're actually going through, let's say like a flow drill, and you're trying to move through and things feel smooth and you can sense what's happening and moving into the next place, then you understand what moving like reeling silk is, and the 2 characters is all you need. But before, it's like a book. So it's like what you were saying before. You have to really expand out on it in order to get down to a simple concept.
Yeah, for sure. And having that, that's a definite benefit to visiting those places where those arts are originally from is you might get a feel for things like what reeling silk means. Like you might have the opportunity to just literally see someone reeling silk, and then you can kind of go, oh, okay, that's that. And that's the, societal and cultural context where those things come from. And that's where the art developed. So it's really important to kind of understand all of these little aspects of daily life that go into the martial arts as well.
Well, so I'm going to segue us now, because we've kind of laid the framework around it. When I saw your presentation on using the Okinawan language, Uchinaguchi, as being interwoven into the martial arts as a way to help, what I gathered was helping the young folks who seem to be about 2 generations out, if I got that right, about 2 generations out from say the grandparents who practiced martial arts or didn't practice martial arts but spoke the original language there, and your effort was to try to use the language in a way so that it was into the martial arts, to keep it alive and help these folks find their identity. So I'm going to just hand it off to you, and I'd love to hear about that work.
Okay, so I'll give you some background to that to start out with. So as a master's student, and as a research student, I had the idea of Canadian identity and martial arts participation, sort of the idea of learning kind of in a physical sense. So in the West, we tend to think of learning as being with your head, and like it's an academic pursuit. It doesn't really involve our bodies. But then martial arts and even things like, tea ceremony or brush painting or whatever, when you think about those things, those are learning with the body. So it's a different kind of modality for learning. So anyway, I was there, working on my Japanese, and I had a sort of an interest. I'd heard about the Okinawan language. I didn't know anything about it, and I was kind of limited as to what classes I could take in my schedule because my husband worked at night, and so I was concerned about all this. So I ended up taking this class in Uchinaguchi, and it was so hard because it was taught completely in Japanese, and I'm like Uchinaguchi in Japanese, and we had to translate this. We watched some video of them performing the Kumi Odori, like the theater, the Okinawan National Theater. It's in Uchinaguchi, and these people are doing the play on a stage, and we had to translate that. We had a little package. I'm like, okay, now translate this into standard Japanese. I'm like, okay. and anyway, but I got to realize from learning about some really basic things about Uchinaguchi that, hey, wait a second, okay, so this is a separate language. It's not a dialect of Japanese, as people say. Japanese is not the parent language. Just they're sister languages and they're separate. They're like Spanish and Portuguese or German and English or something like that. So the speakers can't understand each other. So anyway, I came to realize, okay, so Okinawan martial arts was obviously developed in Okinawa, but in my dojo, I don't think I hear any Uchinaguchi at all. So if that's the case, then why is that? So I started to realize that some dojos, yes, they used a few words, but my dojo, they really didn't use any. And so I went digging a bit further, and I started doing I did a directed studies project as a master's student on like starting to compile the Uchinaguchi martial arts lexicon. And one of the professors, Uechi sensei, he was a Shorin practitioner. So I could ask him, and he was fluent in Uchinaguchi, so I could ask him and he could just translate a lot of these terms, and he remembered the moves, even though I didn't practice anymore, he remembered the moves well enough to, sort of give me a bit of a demo as well. And
Wow.
And then that got, I was thinking, okay, I finished my master's, what am I going to do for the PhD, or to even apply for the PhD? And so I had rooftop gardens that could be used as martial arts spaces, or I had this Uchinaguchi in Okinawan martial arts, and my supervisor said, yeah, do the Uchinaguchi in martial arts. So I did that. I thought of the idea of, people are talking about with endangered languages, there's no space, there's no place to use them. And I've, in person heard this conversation which gets repeated all over the place in countries around the world, because it's all the same the world over. In any indigenous group of people, they've actually probably all got a martial art too, to come to think of it. But they've got a language, and the language has been replaced with the language of the new dominant group in that area. So it's all tied together with land and language and culture. But Okinawa is kind of unique in that 75 to 90% of the people who live in Okinawa are actually kind of ethnically Okinawan. And nobody tracks this, right? This is not, they're just Japanese for all intents and purposes as the census goes. But it's having that Okinawan cultural background that goes back 30,000 years.
Wow.
That's how long that group has been there, and those islands. It's something kind of important, right? So the area of study for this PhD program was Hikaku Chiki Bunka, or comparative regional culture and area studies. Okay. So we didn't really compare anything like comparative literature, but it had to be something about Okinawa and focused on communication or language. So this idea of people not being able to use their language and having conversations where a kid would say to their parent, oh, hey mom, I'd like to learn Uchinaguchi. And the parent would say most of the time, what do you want to learn that for? Where are you going to use it? Right? Because school is in Japanese, everything is in Japanese, so they don't need it.
If I remember correctly, it was either in one of the research articles I know it was outlawed to speak it for a while. That at some point, or basically you would be reprimanded or punished if you weren't speaking Japanese. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. As far as the legality of it, I believe that I can't give you specifics on this, but I believe the language of the schools was officially Japanese. And so there was some variation, but a lot of schools were just like, other areas in the world where if you spoke that Uchinaguchi, you would be punished with there were a whole bunch of different punishments. A taxi driver actually told me this. He said one of them was you had to fill up 2 buckets of water, and you had to stand with your arms outstretched, holding these buckets of water for an entire period outside of the school gates. So everyone would see that you're being punished. And another one was they'd stick a broom handle underneath the knees and then make you sit in seiza. So as you know, this is a good way to dislocate knees if you do it really fast. So, and they'd have to sit like that for a whole period. And there was the Hogen Fuda, that's a really famous one, which is like a plaque. That it was the dialect plaque. So if you got caught speaking Uchinaguchi, you would get this plaque. And the only way to get rid of it was to give it to the next person that you could find as a a little kid speaking Uchinaguchi, so you could get rid of it. And whoever had it at the end of the day would get punished. So, it was really pretty devious because it co-opts everybody into this punishment system.
Wow.
And yet another one was you would have to write the Uchinaguchi on a paper shirt and then wash it and then hang it up in the classroom. And it was kind of symbolic of like cleansing yourself of this language.
Okay.
Because it really was viewed to be a backwards country dialect of Japanese. So that's the perspective people are coming from. And the Okinawans themselves, they weren't victimized. They were all for it. They were like, yeah, okay, let's get rid of that Uchinaguchi because it's holding us back. The only way to succeed in this new society is to learn perfect standard Japanese. So you saw a lot of pressure, especially on the eldest sons, on learning perfect standard Japanese. And at that time, they didn't know as much as they do now about linguistics and the benefits of bilingualism and how learning more than one language actually makes you smarter. And it not only makes you smarter, but it improves both languages. So, so people were worried, if they speak Uchinaguchi, their Japanese is going to be worse. But actually, if they didn't speak Uchinaguchi, the Uchinaguchi and their Japanese would be worse, would be badly affected. So anyway, there's a lot of kind of sociolinguistic things going on there. And they were quite sensible at the time, given the climate. Of course, people would make those choices, right? Yeah.
So as you're saying that, and so for the audience, when did this really get pushed? During the 1960s, after World War II? What kind of time frames are we looking at from this transition of speaking Uchinaguchi, then you weren't allowed, and how was this unfolding as far as a timeline?
So this is like 30s and 40s. And of course, like the 30s is a pretty dark time in human history.
Yes, it
generally,
was. Mm-hmm.
Right? It gave birth to a lot of, people had science, and it gave birth to a lot of dark things. Before the war, they, were really pushing against no Uchinaguchi. During the war, if you were caught speaking Uchinaguchi by Japanese soldiers, you could get shot as a spy because they didn't understand it. And they thought you possibly from China or a spy, so it was very dangerous there as well. But keep in mind, through all this, some of the older people only spoke Uchinaguchi, and some of them made the decision to not speak to their grandkids so they wouldn't wreck their chances at perfect Japanese.
Oh, I guess now I think about it too, is if they didn't speak to the grandchildren, then the grandchild might have a chance of not getting shot.
Right. It makes all sorts of sense, but then you can see how between the punishments in school and the parents and the grandparents wish to have the kids grow up and be successful in a Japanese environment, they're not going to pass that Uchinaguchi on, and even today, there are very few environments where Uchinaguchi is useful. So the whole point of the research was, well, hey. They're not going to teach it in schools anytime soon, probably, but they can use it in martial arts practice. Mm-hmm. Even if, it would be nice to move towards an immersion environment eventually, but there are very few people who speak it fluently enough or who are willing to conduct a class in Uchinaguchi. So that's still hard to do, but I think there are still some older people who could do it. And they did do it. So my sensei, and the Goju-ryu sensei, Megukan sensei in Okinawa, he remembers his grandfather teaching people in Uchinaguchi, completely Uchinaguchi, but they said they didn't understand him.
So I got two questions that pop into my head. First, most of what we're talking about is the spoken language and making sure that you didn't get caught speaking it, and how was it? Was it different as far as the written? Was it a character-based language? Was it a letter alphabet type of language?
So they didn't have a written language until they started borrowing Japanese. They borrowed at first some Chinese characters, and then they also used hiragana from Japanese. So, we've got the Japanese characters, and there's a Chinese reading, there's a Japanese reading, there, Mandarin reading, maybe Taiwanese reading, but there's also an Uchi-no-Guchi reading.
Yeah, I saw some of your examples there on your Facebook page, but I didn't pay attention to it, and it just occurred to me because in the Chinese, it didn't matter which dialect you spoke, everything was written the same because it wasn't an alphabet, and so I didn't know if that was actually the case, if the Okinawans had their own written language, but from what you just said, for the longest time it was just an oral language.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, and I don't know at what point they started using a written language. Of course, they were a tributary kingdom. They were independent, and they were a tributary kingdom of China. So presumably they had some records kept in probably Chinese. And then after, you've got the Satsuma coming in later, and they probably brought the hiragana.
So using the martial arts, and when you say you can use the Uchi-no-Guchi in the martial arts, I think most of your references were like into Shurite or Nahate or something along those lines. Yeah,
you can use those things for Goju-ryu or Shorin-ryu. Yeah, Shuri or Naha.
Okay. Because I didn't know if having the Shurite type of martial art with the language, it'd be such a corporeal type of experience of having that embodiment of the martial arts, as you spoke about earlier, with the language of the martial arts, the expectations. Is that happening now in places? Is that what you're trying to get to happen with some of your work and effort?
Yeah, it was already happening when I started doing the research. So there already were some dojos. I'm sure there are some, like many that I didn't visit, that are probably completely in Uchi-no-Guchi, maybe further in the north. But even in the south, in Naha, there's one of the bigger dojo groups, Goju-kai, and Morio Higona Sensei, he uses some Uchi-no-Guchi terms, so Chiri no Chan-chan, and Muchimi, and Muchi, and that kind of thing. So they're already using them, and those terms have already kind of spread to places like the UK, along with the where the practitioners are from. Okay. So that's a good development. So they're kind of like, there's a little bit of a basis, and I think there's room to introduce more.
Yeah, so I'm going to have to ask, do you have a dictionary or something? So like if somebody like myself wanted to see a move, or is there a video, or saying, okay, this is this motion, and this is what it's called in Uchi-no-Guchi, or how would someone like myself find a resource to at least get me started?
So I've got the Okinawan Karate and Kabuto handbook, which is a book that shows all of I call them word sheets that have been done so far. So there's a digital copy of that on the Facebook page, but I can also send you one. But it doesn't show the movements. It just has kind of like a picture. Like some of the pages of it are in the slides of that presentation.
Oh yes, I saw that. That's what triggered my question.
So there are I think there are 36 pages total right now. There's a lot possible, and kind of like 60 total in the works. And the plan was to go to Okinawa this summer and continue working on it. So,
well, I'll tell you what I'll do. If you anything that you'll share with me as far as the language and your work and things along those lines, I will post it on the website for the audience, so that when they go to the website to listen to this particular podcast, or as they're hearing me say it now, they'll know that it's there, that there'll be links there for them to download. For all those people who've signed up over at the website, they can get the links for it. And so the booklet would be awesome. I'd love to see that myself. And in regards to the research of taking the children and then I'm assuming they were already in the martial arts, and then you started using the Uchi-no-Guchi to help them find their roots or understand their identities and their ancestral identities a little bit more?
Unfortunately, that didn't happen. I would love to see that happen more, but all we managed to do was I distributed the handbook to a bunch of different dojo and in Okinawa and abroad, and then the instructors were able to kind of use it however they saw fit in their class.
Okay.
So what would be great is using that, as you say, with the really little kids.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean the parents have to be able to speak it and understand it as well for it to really take hold and be successful. So one of the best, I guess, language revitalization programs in the world is Hawaii, and they focused first on the kids, but then also on the some other programs, and that one as well, on the parents, so they can actually speak to the kids at home, because there's a lot of literature about immersion programs and not being successful because the parents can't speak. So it's kind of got to be everybody,
right, to keep it to go together.
Yeah, that's right. Be multi-generational. Yeah.
Well, I know I'm definitely interested in learning some more about the process of that. Besides the study by Melissa that we had mentioned earlier, in her study it was the influence of identity on language, and in her findings she said the study responses showed that these people had complex experience regarding their Japanese and English language use. So she was looking at some of the young folks who were bicultural, and I'm assuming in the way that you stated it there, the Okinawans were bicultural, right? They were Okinawans, but they were Japanese, and especially if they were 1980s, 1990s, they were definitely bicultural.
That's right. So it's kind of a sneaky kind of biculturalism, though, because their culture's not entirely recognized. It's like recognized as being bicultural to the point that they're not not proper or not standard Japanese. So people are like, okay, Okinawa is a bit different from Japan, and Okinawa's kind of had to put up with some things that the rest of Japan has not had to put up with, like all the American military bases. Mm-hmm. I mean, mind you, some of that is just geography, but their train, because the Americans had control of Okinawa, things like their railways were never rebuilt. They had railways before the war. When the Americans were there in Okinawa, as an American protectorate, they're using American currency. And the Americans kind of wanted to encourage Okinawan independence. So for Okinawa to be like maybe a politically separate entity from Japan again, probably to serve American interests, to be honest. And so they encouraged the use of uchi-naguchi. But the Okinawans wanted the Americans to go. So, of course, they resisted the use of uchi-naguchi because it was being encouraged by the Americans.
Okay.
They wanted to be Japanese. So I would say many young Okinawans wouldn't think of themselves as being bicultural at all, and maybe some would. There's definitely some Okinawan traditions, like cultural traditions that are alive and well, like a lot, like karate and the Asa dance and things like that. They don't have on mainland Japan, but whether the students would have an awareness that how different they were from mainland Japan or not is another question.
To your knowledge, especially since you had the experience of being there, are there other congregational type of places that uchi-naguchi would perhaps show itself up? Because I know a lot of the research studies with the ethnographic researchers and anthropology studies that they refer a lot to congregational places like temples, schools, martial arts studios, places like that. Was there any place else that you might find that, besides the martial arts dojo, that uchi-naguchi may show up? Definitely.
There's the Sanshin Club, or Sanshin practitioners. And basically Sanshin is the Okinawan version of the shamisen, which is a 3-stringed banjo.
Oh.
It looks kind of like a lute. It's got that, you may have seen it with a snake skin sort of body often, and people play this and they sing. And in those circles, in the Sanshin community, uchi-naguchi is quite encouraged, and people do greet each other in uchi-naguchi.
The songs, are they in uchi-naguchi as well?
And the songs are in uchi-naguchi as well.
Huh. Now,
so,
out of curiosity, those... Because that's an amazing, because a lot of times we do correlate the corporeal experiences of the martial arts with dance, theater, because it's an embodied knowledge. And when you're referring to this singing and playing of the music, In the Okinawan culture, do their songs do they sometimes just tell stories?
I'm guessing they would. I honestly don't know enough about the songs myself to tell you for sure, but I'm guessing they would, just because that seems to be a thing that songs do, and certainly the National Theater as well. That's all in Uchinaguchi. And I've heard that sometimes they get it wrong, and the people who are fluent in Uchinaguchi are kind of, thinking their thoughts, and that's all subtitled in Japanese as well.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, as far as the people sitting out there complaining about pronunciation, they do that to me all the time as well, because I'm from North Carolina. So I always use the excuse that if I can go to the website and look up pronunciation, and it's got 17 different pronunciations for something like Uchinaguchi, for example, I'll take my best stab at it, and just as long as we are fulfilling communication. But I think that's amazing that the theater itself in Okinawa's are in Uchinaguchi.
Yeah, it's a special theater just for that kind of performance, and so that's Uchinaguchi, but the actual actors and actresses may not actually speak it, so they probably don't. It's usually only people above a certain age, and they're kind of like some people that still speak Uchinaguchi at a very fluent level, but they tend to be older. They tend to be maybe not the firstborn son, but maybe the youngest son who got to spend time with grandma, or they were raised by their grandparents. So of course their grandparents are going to speak to them in Uchinaguchi, and then it works really well that way. But it's just kind of like getting to be a smaller and smaller minority of younger people who can speak it fluently. And then of course there is a problem with the older people. If you ever have the experience of like you're saying with your pronunciation, it's not very encouraging for you to learn the language if people are always going, oh, your pronunciation's terrible, or it's not going to motivate you the way so it's the same with Uchinaguchi is the older people have to allow for some kind of linguistic change, and they have to in a sense like kind of take what they can get, like not that you should settle but for low standards, but that you have to accept that people are trying their best, and it might not be perfect because they don't have a lot of opportunity to use it or speak it.
Well, that's that right there speaks a lot to the martial arts too, because when I'm teaching in my martial arts, and for me it's always about the effort, and that the effort is performance will come. It's the effort that, like you said in the very beginning, if you just show up and start the work, then performance will get there, but you've got to make that effort in the beginning.
Yeah, and that's absolutely true, for academics as well. And, I'd have presentations to do, and I'd have no idea, like absolutely no. I'd know, okay, I kind of want to do something on this theme, but there'd be no good ideas about how to start it or anything. But I found just like, in training, you might have a lot of days that are very mediocre, but if you just put in the time, if you just sit there in front of the computer, if you just practice a language or study it, then eventually you'll get good results. It's just, how long will it take? That's all.
Yeah, that's right. And that's where the patience clicks in. Another question I have is in regards to, and I know we're coming up close to about 45, 50 minutes, so I won't keep you too much longer, but how would you describe the dojos in Okinawa as compared to, say, dojos you may have visited in Canada, America, or Japan? What was there a cultural difference as far as the attitude or how you were accepted, or anything along those lines that you recall?
I think the first thing is it's interesting how similar the environments are, like how much of the culture they're able to carry over from Okinawa or Japan into a dojo space in anywhere in the world. So physically, I have some pictures I've collected, and you can see the resemblance is really striking. You can't tell, given a picture of a dojo, is that in Okinawa or is it in Canada? Sometimes you can just tell by the size, like, oh, that's too big to be Okinawa. Okay,
so they were smaller dojos.
Yeah, because buildings and spaces just tend to be smaller in Okinawa, but culturally, that's really a hard one. I mean, I find it's a very Japanese-like space. It depends, of course, on how many actual people from Japan or Okinawa you have practicing with you, that does a lot. But as far as something can be Okinawan or Japanese without actual Japanese people in it, a lot of the dojos that I've seen abroad have done like a really excellent job. And the techniques that they're using, the way they count, all of these things are like very reminiscent of things they're doing in Japan and Okinawa. And one of the interesting things, it's almost like a test, like, oh, okay, how much are they replicating it? Well, we're still doing stuff that they did in the 40s or 50s in Japan. We're still doing those things in Canada. So, for example, you can say something like sensei ni taishite rei, which is like, bow to the honorable sensei. But apparently this language, which I just took for granted, I was just repeating it, because that's what you do. My professor in Okinawa said, oh, that's imperialistic sounding language from this very warlike time, and we don't use that anymore. And the same with the Japanese national anthem. I lived in Japan for 8.5 years. I never once heard the anthem. I went to all kinds of school assemblies. They never sang their national anthem. But my kids' Japanese school in Vancouver, I heard the anthem at least twice now. So it's kind of like, you take a culture and it gets dispersed, and there's little pocket communities here and there, and it's kind of like they change in their own way. So as far as acceptance goes, I found the acceptance is really high, like it's really good all the way, all the way around Okinawa. It's really pretty excellent, especially for, I'm a woman, I'm dealing with a lot of older Japanese men, and they don't seem to really care that I'm I'm a woman, and talking to, or a foreign woman, they don't even really care about that. So the unifier is the martial arts and the practice.
That's what I was hoping for, is that the martial arts was the focus and not the person there. Is that we're here as a family to practice our martial arts.
That's right, and you get that. One of the sheets that's not in the presentation, what I think it's not in there, it's basically you're all a family. It's the martial arts global family, and I have an article for you. I can send it to you. It's about how martial arts promotes a practice of peace, because you've got all these people from lots of different environments, and they're primed to hate each other based on political problems between their countries or differences in language or religion. They've got their deadly martial arts skills, right? They can they don't need any weapons here, they've got the martial arts goods, and they've got reasons to not get along, but they all do, partly because they have to, but it is that martial arts that's bringing them together, and often most of the time there's not even any animosity. Those political differences don't matter.
Wow. If someone was going to start and using something like the shurite, nahate, or another form of the Okinawa martial arts, do you think it would actually be possible for someone, let's say, of a Okinawan background, they're second or third generation Canadian, but their grandparents were from Okinawa, for example, right? And they were trying to find their cultural roots a little bit, is that having the language involved in their martial arts could actually help them identify a little bit more about where they came from?
Yeah, I think so. If they could, that would be, again, something from a long time ago, maybe even from their grandparents' time. And if you're Japanese, unlike people who are not Japanese, who have not grown up in the culture, you can kind of take up martial arts as a hobby, and then maybe you do it for so long and then you quit or something. But for Japanese people, it seems like it's a road that's really serious, and you don't undertake it lightly. And once you get on that road, it's like a serious business. So it would be interesting to see how that person was going to approach it. Especially being involved with their family's roots and everything. It's got another layer of pretty meaningful stuff, and on many levels involved with that.
Well, tell me, if somebody wanted to find you, how would they find you?
The name of the page is Uchinaguchi and Okinawan Martial Arts.
Okay.
So it's Uchinaguchi with the Uchinaaguchi.
Okay. And I have links to it at Kung Fu Podcast, so I'll make sure that they can find it. Or is there any other social media? Are you on Twitter or anything like that, or is the Facebook page the only one?
The Facebook is the only one. I'd like to have a website, and like you mentioned at the very beginning, I would absolutely love to, and I'm thinking about sort of how to do this. I'd like to have a website where you have a video component to go with each of the terms, so that, you know, I could go to these karate masters and film them demonstrating the move, and then people could see the word, they could hear the word, they could see the motion associated with it, and then maybe see the word in a couple of sample sentences as well.
So if I was able to round up somebody who would do a set of shurite form, you might be able to take the video, or perhaps we could work on it together and put the names in the Uchinaguchi to the movement in their kata?
Yeah, I mean, I can probably get the shurite people. I mean, the more the merrier for sure. That the thing would be the website hosting. If I, if I could have my my druthers, I'd ask the University of the Ryukyus to host it, because they're the only national university in Okinawa. So it would kind of be appropriate that they hosted it, perhaps along with, some other institution. And it would definitely, it would be accessed by a lot of people around the world, I think.
Yeah, well, you rest assured that Kung Fu Podcast will have either links to it or excerpts from it. I will work with you any way we can.
That would be excellent, because I mean, even just a website, a pre-video website, just to have the various articles and things have some kind of a space for people who don't use Facebook.
Right.
It would be good. Yeah.
Well, then consider some of the links and resources that you're going to send me are links to it. I will download them. I'll put them on my server, and so that visitors to Kung Fu Podcast can go to this webpage and find those links and find you and your work. Before we get ready to go, is there anything else you'd like to add?
Just basically to encourage people to keep at it with whatever art they're practicing, and to experiment with other arts as well, and to, if they're doing Okinawan karate, to consider using Uchinaguchi terminology, or especially asking their teachers in Okinawa about the Okinawan terms, because that interest is what's going to motivate the teachers there to use it more.
Yeah, well, that would be great. And is there anything you'd like to ask me?
Oh, how long have you been doing the Kung Fu Podcast? I did a bit of research, but not that much. I couldn't, no time.
Well, I started Kung Fu Podcast about 3 years ago, and it's podcasting is it was a challenge. What it takes to put one together and to make it all come together. It's really helped me get introduced to some really fine folks around the world who are involved in martial arts for various reasons. Researchers like Dr. Ben Judkins, who's just a fantastic guy, Paul Bowman, who's over in the UK, Ian Abernathy, who's a practitioner and just a big supporter of Kung Fu Podcasts. And thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you for inviting me. This has been really great. This is actually my first podcast about this particular research, so it's hopefully an exciting step in the right direction. And I did receive a grant from the Foundation for Endangered Languages in the UK. So part of that grant money is supposed to go towards sending physical copies of the handbook. It's an in-progress handbook, but I can send copies to people who want them.
Yeah.
So,
okay.
Yeah, well, just let me know about that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, count me on that list, and then we'll have some others. And well, thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
All right. I learned so many things during that interview and during the editing process because I got to re-listen to it again. But since the interview and before this publication, Samantha sent me an email, and she says, "Thank you very much for the interview on Friday. I'm not really sure if I covered everything, but it was a pleasure to talk with you about the martial arts in Uchinaguchi. She said that she'd also like to add, my research on Uchinaguchi and Okinawa martial arts was sponsored by MEXT, which is the acronym for Japanese Ministry of Education, Culture, Sports, Science, and Technology. And her research is continuing to be sponsored by the Foundation of Endangered Languages. Then she writes, quote, as you mentioned in your podcast with Ian Abernathy, there are always drivers with one's martial arts practice or other pursuits. And one of my drivers was quite literally Kaki no Hana, Keishun of Shirin-kai Shorin-ryu Karate. He independently wanted to create an Uchinaguchi martial arts lexicon, and when I started to train with him and told him of my research, he arranged most of my interviews with other Okinawan martial artists and often actually drove me to the interview sites or hosted the interviews in his dojo. The in-progress Okinawan Karate and Kabuto Handbook is a result of these interviews and is freely available through this link. End quote. The link will be over at kungfupodcast.com/123, as well as links to her Facebook page and other materials. She also said that the Okinawan Karate and Kabuto Handbook is available in Italian and Portuguese, with French and other languages in the works. She goes on to write, the handbook is not only my research, but a collaborative effort between Uchinaguchi-speaking martial artist teachers and even non-martial arts practitioners. We worked on the Uchinaguchi, Japanese, and English sentences together, and the Uchinaguchi and Japanese was typically proofread by around 6 different people to make sure it was correct. There are actually 6 separate Ryukyuan languages, each with many very different dialects. Uchinaguchi has the largest number of speakers and is on the main island of Okinawa. The work on the handbook is probably a subject for another day, but to avoid a host of problems, I use Shibai Kutuba, which is the kind of Uchinaguchi used by traditional Okinawan theater groups who traveled throughout Okinawa and needed to be understood wherever they performed. And then she finishes by saying, you asked me about the culture shock going to Okinawa, but the only culture shock I can think of is coming back to Canada. I would like for you to go out and search her Facebook page. It's called Uchinaguchi. You'll pop right up and like her page. Now, one of the things that came up for me later, which was a question about Funakoshi. He was born November 10th, 1868 in Shuri, Okinawa, which by that I'm assuming that he spoke Uchinaguchi or some dialect thereof it, and not Japanese. And these questions are totally for my curiosity. Maybe I'll get to dig into them later. Or if one of you are listening and you know the answers to this, I'd love to hear from you. But even on this program, we have had what was described as interpretations of his work, his written work, which that really triggered my question. What were they interpreting? We just heard Professor May describe that Uchinaguchi didn't have a written language. And when it was developed both out of Chinese characters and Japanese characters. Now, I think it's very easy for all of us to accept the fact that Funakoshi was not only an incredibly hard worker in his life and in his martial arts, but he had to speak one of the dialects of Uchinaguchi in order to be taught. And if that was his first language, which didn't have a written counterpart, was many of his initial writings both in this combination hybrid form of both Chinese and Japanese characters. I believe it's also safe to say that we could all get on board with the fact that being beyond a hard worker, Funakoshi had to be bilingual, articulate, and apparently worked just as hard in becoming educated before the rest of the Okinawan people were being required to change their languages. Since his first publication was in 1922, I was just curious of what language that he wrote that in. I'm going to assume it was mostly Japanese, but is it possible that it was part of that hybrid language? And if so, how do you interpret that without knowing Uchi Naguchi and knowing how they were pulling stuff together. But again, that's a curiosity question, and it more or less just speaks to the foresight that Funakoshi had as well. As I bring this to a close, here's a list of the downloads that will be available on the webpage at kungfupodcast.com/123. A 21-page ebook titled A Martial Arts Perspective on Using Uchi Naguchi in Okinawan Karate and Kabuto, and I have both the English and Japanese translations. The next article, which I really encourage you to look at, is Practicing Peace that you heard Professor May mention, the International Okinawan Martial Arts Community, as a community of practice. That is part of a 35-page journal ebook. The next download available to you is the International Review of Ryukyuan and Okinawan Studies Journal, the feasibility of Uchi Naguchi in Okinawan Karate and Kabuto classes. Then, of course, the Okinawan Karate and Kabuto Handbook, which is a 45-page ebook, and lastly, a 29-page presentation, Professor Samantha May's work, titled Embodied Language Revitalization, Linking Uchi Naguchi, Okinawan Martial Arts, and Well-Being. Exploring the culture, the adventure, and the impact of martial arts. I really do hope that you enjoyed this podcast for many years to come. It is one of the most educational podcasts that I think I've done since I've started Kung Fu Podcast, because I learned so many things in an area that I had no idea existed. The history, the tie-ins, the politics, war, cultures. There was so much in it. And then how are we trying to keep it alive? But it all kind of boils down to this. You are a martial artist. I'm a martial artist. Maybe we come from different places and do different things, but we all still work. And remember that almost all martial arts that we have ever found or discovered came because somebody was being suppressed, being put down, and they were trying to find a way to protect themselves and to keep themselves safe and their family safe. Well, today, I want you to go out there and practice with the idea and the concepts that many have come before us. And even though we may come from different places, we all want to stay safe, keep your community safe, keep yourself safe. Take care, and I'll be talking with you again next week.